And we're back to the Quakers, and we have a member of the Society of Friends, Ron Goodbody, who's a colleague of Peter's, and he's going to talk to us about Society of Friends and Quaker Relief in Mayo. So, Society of Friends and Quaker Relief in Mayo. So this will be our final session for today. And just in case anybody gets up and runs when he's finished, thank you all for being here, and you know, we hope to see you again tomorrow. But we're not finished. It's the teacher mentality. They hear the bell and boom, you're talking to yourself. You know, so I don't want that to happen. So just, you know, we listen to Ron, what he has to say. Maybe we'll have a few questions for him, and then we'll be heading off after that. So Ron, listen.
Thanks very much. Graveyard shift tonight. Yeah, I'm aware that we're behind time, and I've tried to keep it to a reasonable time, because I have to be out of here by midnight. Before I start, I'm concentrating on Mayo here, but the first few slides I'm going to run are just going to set the background to how this whole Quaker system was set up. So it's kind of general, but I think it'll be necessary in order to understand what was going on in the relief works in Mayo. And for anyone who has, I'm giving these away free of charge, so anyone who hasn't got it, one of those, giving these away free of charge, so anyone who hasn't got it, one of those, suitable channels, Quaker Relief in the Great Famine. There's copies on the table at the back, and if there aren't, they're in a box on the floor. So don't anyone leave without one of those. So there's something on Mayo on that, but it's a very small book and it deals with the whole country. That's obviously our period from the famine. And first of all, it just needs to say just something about who these people were, the Quakers. Well, essentially, it's a small Christian sect established in England in about 1650. The concept came to Ireland very shortly after that, and there's been Quakers in Ireland ever since, but a very small number. And about the time of the famine, the total number of Quakers in Ireland was approximately 3,000. So put that in the context of a population as a whole heading for 9 million. So a very small group. And just to give you, it's not just they're small, it's the distribution that's very important as well. In 1794, for some reason, Quakers in Ireland had a map produced showing all of the Quaker meeting houses, what days of the week they met at those. It will show us that here's Mayo. Well, let's get the right colours for Mayo, shall we? Yeah. The meeting houses were predominantly in the east, and if you drew a line from Coleraine to Bantry, there were only two to the west of it in Roscommon. And so that was all. Ballymurray was on its last legs at that stage. That's the remnants of the Quakers who had been here in Newport, who had left Newport and settled to the west of the Shannon in Roscommon. But at the time of the famine, there was just one family left. And the father of the family is quite elderly. They weren't really involved in the famine at all, so we can discount Ballymurray. In fact, he died during the famine, nothing to do with the famine at all, and the rest of the family left. So we can seriously discount this one, the only one anywhere remotely close to Mayo. And this is the meeting house there at Ballymurray in Roscommon, which still survives today, but not looking very happy. So we have the failure of the potato in 1845, bringing about a food shortage, and followed by the worst hit in the following year, bringing us the famine. Allied to which there were poor grain harvests, the herring deserted the shores, and so that's the background to, and you probably know. So that's the background to, and you probably know all of that. So when that happened, Quakers in Dublin met on the 13th of November 1846, and they established a relief committee, aware of the fact that something needed. So those are the three ideas they had. They wanted to receive subscriptions, distribute funds, and importantly to gather information on what was going on. The committee had 21 members. They were all Dublin based because, remember, that there was only one railway in Ireland. Well, there was a railway, so if you're going to have regular, frequent meetings, they'd all have to be living close together. So Dublin based. But they had 21 what they call corresponding members from other parts of the Quaker community in Ireland in constant contact by letter to pass in information as to what was going on. And so that all helped. But of course, there's no representation whatsoever from the Western counties for the reasons I've explained. There were no Quakers in those areas. So, who were these people? Well, this is an extremely important. So, who were these people? Well, this is an extremely important point in how the whole Quaker relief happened, because most of the people on that committee, that Central Relief Committee is called, I'd probably call it the CRC, because we're short of time, but most of them were merchants, because we're short of time, but most of them were merchants. And that meant that they had the ability to shift products around the place by various means of transport. And also the Quakers had an entire, it's called the Society of Friends, so if we talk about the Society of Friends, that's who I mean. The whole thing was run by committee system, and that was nationwide throughout Ireland. So they were all familiar with each other throughout the land, and they also had close contacts with Quakers in Britain and America, and that is extremely good. Meanwhile, at the same time as the Irish Quakers were meeting up, Quakers in Britain met up as well. And they decided to, this is independently of what was going on in Ireland, they got together immediately, but collect information, again, essential. Establish a subscription fund, which blends in with the Irish one, collecting subscriptions, and to arrange distribution honestly and prudently, and that would always be an important factor. So they decide to liaise with friends, or that's a word that is interchangeable with Quaker, and to find out what was happening in Ireland and to seek advice from Ireland as to what British Quakers could do. So they decide to divide the responsibility between the two of them. London would be fundraising in Britain. They would have a small amount of direct relief if people wanted it, going to be extremely important as well. Dublin would be responsible for distribution of relief, and they would also be raising funds within Ireland and anywhere else that they could get it. So information was passed on to the Quaker community, not just in Britain and Ireland, but also elsewhere, not just in Britain and Ireland, but also elsewhere, predominantly the United States. So by this was addresses to members that basically printed and sent out pamphlets describing what was going on in Ireland, and there was a need for a united effort. In London, they also sent out something around Britain, because remember, and what we read in the books about the famine, that in Britain there was a lot of disinformation going around, that the famine was, in some reports, the famine was not all that significant, they were just exaggerating, etc., etc. So what they wanted to do was to make sure that accurate information would be spread throughout Britain and elsewhere. So they're also investigating the inadequacy of relief works, and just telling people around the country of that. So meanwhile, as soon as they got going, information started to come in from members of the public, which helped them to organise what they needed to do. On this one, letters from members of the who'd heard of the new Quaker relief organisation wrote to tell of conditions in their own areas. A correspondent from Crossmolina wrote at the end of December 1846, describing how half of the 20,000 inhabitants of the parish were in a state of destitution, but to have 5,000 of the town's inhabitants within the parish of Kilmore were labourers who could not afford a day's idleness even in normal times. A further 1,500 outside the town were landless, and 700 were small farmers. These people were at the mercy of the middlemen landlords and who had their lands tied up in mortgages. Through letters such as these, the Central Relief Committee was able to assess the quantities of relief which were required in various parts of the country. I might just add at this stage, you'll find a lot of information here about what's going on in North Mayo, and particularly North West Mayo, and somewhat less what's going on in the South. And the reason for that isn't to suggest that there was nothing happening in the South. It's just, as we've already been told, the area north, and particularly areas much more impoverished than the rest of Mayo. And so a lot of works were brought into that area to help the famine relief. But throughout Mayo, distribution of food would have been happening everywhere. So part of the system for gathering information, on which to base their relief efforts. So as soon as the Quakers in London had met, some of them set off from London, particularly William Forster, who was from Norwich. He set off from London and there's some of the places there that he toured, mainly in the West. And at various times he was accompanied by other Quakers, not for the entire 4.5 months, but for part of the time. His son, William E Forster, James Hackchuk, whom we've heard mentioned earlier, and various members of the Irish Quaker community. This was the first of many fact-finding tours that were carried out by various Quakers through particularly the early months and into 1847. So William Forster, as I say, he toured in 1847. He made contact with a number of local people who were to receive significant amounts of Quaker relief, such as George Vaughan Jackson of Carramore Ballina, W.J. Burke of Killala, and Annesley Knox of Rappa Castle, including Swinford, Lacken and Bala. And this table, and I'm not going to read it all out, but you can just look there. There's 4 areas that is listed: Killala, Belmullet, Newport and Westport. And this is the kind of relief that in the first 2 months of January, February 1847, that they distributed in those areas. A lot of this was been done because, as there were no Quakers in that area, they were not running soup kitchens, they were not distributing food. But there were other people in the areas, very often either clergy, who were trying to run their own soup kitchens but didn't have the wherewithal to purchase the food to keep them running. So this food here would have helped local people in running their own soup kitchens on the way, including the supply of boilers for opening up soup. So William Todhunter was one of the Irish Quakers who was involved. He's a relatively young man. He got extremely heavily involved in the relief efforts. And one of the things he did, because he accompanied William Forster part of the tour, he was responsible for a ton of Indian meal to be delivered to Delphi Lodge in January 1847. Another of the Irish Quakers in touring there was Richard D. Webb, who arranged for 10 bags of rice and 2 bags of meal to be delivered to George Darcy in Bingham Castle. And this is the receipt, because all through the famine relief efforts, there were 2 criteria that they demanded of anyone that they gave food for distribution. One is it had to be properly accounted for, and 2 is it had to be properly accounted for, and 2 is it had to be given out to people regardless of their religious persuasion. And they checked up on this, and if there was ever a hint that either of those 2 criteria was being ignored, then that would be an end to that particular person being given food for distribution, to make sure there's no proselytizing and make sure that everything is accounted for. And this is one of the most detailed accounts I've ever seen, and comes from Bingham Castle. Just to zoom in on the top bit of it, we actually have individual family names here listed, and so there's the 6 in the family, and they're given this quantity of rice and this quantity of meal. So all these names here and there, so anyone who's interested in that area, this is kind of very interesting information as background to who was there at the time of the famine. So William Forster's father in January in Westport, which he found, quote, to be a strange and fearful sight, like what we read in beleaguered cities, its streets crowded with gaunt wanderers, sauntering to and fro with hopeless air and hunger-struck look, a mob of starved, almost naked women around the poorhouse, clamouring, reported that Louisburg was the populous and most distressed parish. The surgeon of the dispensary there describing the people as swept off by dysentery, the most usual form of famine plague, by 10 or 20 a day. The Forsters left Mayo the next day for Connemara, but they were to return later. The Forsters left Mayo the next day for Connemara, but they were to return later when they met another English Quaker travelling in the area. And this was William Bennett, also quite a young man, you see, only in his mid-20s. And he was an English Quaker, and he felt, having attended one of those meetings of the British Quakers, felt that he could make a positive contribution to helping the destitute in Ireland. Looking beyond the short term, he determined to travel in the west of Ireland to distribute seeds of green crops to help people to break their dependence on the potato and give them an alternative that would be more reliable. He landed in Dublin in March 1847, and after discussions with the Central Relief Committee, purchased a large quantity of seeds from Drummond's in Dawson Street and set out by coach to the west. In Ballina on 14th of March, and there in the hotel they held what he imagined to be the first Quaker meeting for worship ever held in the town. William Bennett began his distribution of seeds on the old Killala Road, where he found a widow who was left without an income since her tenants had deserted her. But William Bennett believed that a donation of seeds would help her support herself once more. He then moved into Erris, passing through Crossmolina and heading west and north to reach over into Erris. Here he found that the Church of Ireland rector and his daughter had set up a soup kitchen. And were feeding large numbers of people daily. They had been given assistance by William Forster's party to extend the soup kitchen, and while William Bennett was there, they received a bale of clothing from London Quakers. He reported that the difficulty of selection was very great, where the supply, though good and serviceable, was but a drop in the rolling ocean of destitution and nakedness. So William Bennett then proceeded, well, say, to Balmullet. His writings are haunting in their description of misery which he witnessed. In Balmullet he recorded seeing scenes of human misery and degradation which long afterwards still haunted his imagination with the vividness and power of some horrid and tyranny. It was his impression that 1/4 of those he saw were in a dying state beyond the reach of any relief that could now be afforded, and many more would follow. He left some seed with the local Church of Ireland minister, and he also gave £10 to the minister's wife, who was running a training school for local industry. I visited a soup kitchen, which had been set up in the schoolhouse, and with the assistance of William Forster's party, he reported it was being managed extremely well. While he was there, another consignment of clothing arrived from London Quakers and was distributed locally, leading William Bennett to record how strange it was to see people in Mayo dressed in Quaker clothing. One of the projects suggested to William Bennett was the encouragement of flax growing to diversify local employment. To this end, he agreed to supply the seed to diversify local employment. To this end, he agreed to supply the seed and the finance for the cultivation of 5 acres of flax in the mullet, and this offer was later doubled by a Belfast Quaker. While William Forster and William Bennett were touring in the West, the Central Relief Committee in Dublin had set up its own system of administration for providing aid. This committee retained responsibility for distributing relief to Connaught and set up a subcommittee with 4 members administering the requests for relief. 47, the Quaker relief operation consisted of an administrative organisation which received applications for assistance from local areas and assessed them for their requirements. A donation could then be given if the need were considered to be great and the applicant for the aid was seen to be reliable. Those who sought assistance and the professional classes. To minimise the risk of misuse of donations, the committee gave relief in small consignments of about £10 worth at a time, so that if anyone didn't handle this properly, they wouldn't get any more. Occasionally, incidents of misappropriation. A magistrate from Connaught in Ballina was suspected of this in the summer of 1849. The committee was also concerned that there should be no proselytising, as I've said before, so that was a very strict tenet. So while Irish Quakers donated generous amounts of money towards relief efforts, a great deal more was raised by the Society of Friends in Britain. From early 1847, help began to arrive from America and American Quakers. Initially in cash, but once the St. Lawrence Seaway reopened, American help came predominantly as shipments of food. Ultimately, a substantial proportion of the Quaker relief supplies came from America, chiefly through New York, where the Friends Relief Organisation collected donations from far and wide and from all manner of people. This one is one that was particularly an issue for Quakers, because one basic thing of Quakerism from the outset has been peace and the avoidance of war and everything. So it was kind of like swords beaten into plowshares when they found American military vessels feeding the starving. That's actually in Cork. That's one of the American vessels that came in at that time. Early in 1847, English Quakers organised considerable amounts of food supplies and persuaded the government to provide 2 steamships to carry them to the west of Ireland. One of these, the 47, and this is actually an illustration from the British magazine Pictorial Weekly, showing that ship arriving off the Mullet and the so grateful Irish peasants being dutifully happy with it. So I think it's a little bit, should we say, condescending, but and nonetheless, at least some of the British periodicals were treating the famine with some kind of seriousness. So ultimately, a substantial amount of the Quaker relief supplies came from America, and so they also got donations. So this is the scourge arriving, and the report from this ship found that the fearful state of starvation and destitution in the barony of Erris is such as no language can portray. Of the total Of the total population of 30,000, it was estimated that 18,000 had no means of subsistence and were reliant on the 4 soup kitchens which had been set up locally. The 2 ships delivered food and soup boilers to various places, including Belmullet and Westport, but in the West at any price, and the facilities for bringing food in overland were inadequate and liable to be pillaged. A deal was struck with the government commissariat, through which supplies arriving in Ireland for the Quaker relief were given over to the food depots maintained by the commissariat in exchange for credit throughout the country, and hence the Quaker relief effort was spared the cost and trouble of transporting and warehousing. To serve Mayo, there were government depots at Ballina, Balmullet and Westport. throughout the hard winter of 1846-47, the Quaker Relief Committee supplied food. That actually is a Quaker, it's a very well known illustration. It is actually a Quaker soup kitchen, but not typical of what was going on in Mayo. This is almost in the industrial scale. It's in the city of Cork. But that's, so that wherever there was a large number of Quakers or sufficient soup kitchens. But elsewhere, as I say, it was local people. And this one, I think we can be comfortable in saying this was soup kitchen was not run by Quakers. I don't think any Quaker lady of the day would have been baring her shoulders quite as daringly as that. Been baring her shoulders quite as daringly as that. In the spring of 1847, the government system of relief was changed through the passing of the Temporary Relief Act, which discontinued the system of relief works. Instead, the destitute were to be fed through soup kitchens run by the poor law unions at the workhouses. The Central Relief Committee recognised that there would be a time lapse after the closing of the relief works and before the opening of the new soup kitchens, and intensified efforts from April to July 18 in order to minimise the hardship that resulted from this changeover. From the outset, many Quakers involved in the relief efforts believed that the best use of their resources would be through assisting medium to long-term projects which would help the people to be more self-supporting. By the summer of 1847, the government soup kitchen, the amount of additional help which would be offered through the Quaker soup kitchens would be so minuscule as to make no appreciable difference. Reports from the poor law unions showed that the situation was extremely severe. In the Ballina Union, there were 72,500 people recorded in Belmullet, which had a population of 13,300 in 1841. Other districts were in very poor state were Lacan, Atimas, Kilgarvan, Binghamstown. However, the resources available to the Central Relief Committee were now so small as to severely restrict the gratuitous distribution of food. At this stage, the important and agonising decision was made to become more involved in projects which would have a longer-term impact. The most obvious project would be one which would provide food in the short term and become self-sustaining to help in the long-term support of the inhabitants. And one of the best ways of doing this was through fisheries. From the summer of 1847, the committee began to support new fishery projects in the West, in addition to supporting the established ones. One of the Quaker visitors to Mayo was Richard D. Webb, as I mentioned, and he learned that fish were apparently abundant off the coast of Mayo, but the people were unable to take advantage as their boats were unsuitable and their tackle poor and inefficient. In the following autumn of 18, and reported to the committee on the appalling state of Erris. In the book which he published about his journey, he said, "Afflicting as is the general condition of Mayo, human wretchedness seems concentrated in Erris. The culminating point of one man's physical degradation seems to have been reached in the Mullet, and that many people could find employment through the fisheries." He recommended that the committee's correspondent in Bangor, William T. Campbell, was reliable, and Campbell offered to establish a fishery at Belmullet as an agent of the committee. As a result, fishing boats and 10 curraghs. This project was one of 4 which the committee started at this time. The fishery in Belmullet was kept going for 2 years until November 1849, when members of the committee visited to inspect it. They found that William Campbell did not have much experience in fisheries and had not supervised the project adequately, unfortunately. But other fisheries locally were seen to be more successful, including one at Achill Sound and another at Kilry Harbour. It showed that improper management was what had happened in William Campbell's case, rather than the local circumstances, and the committee wound up Campbell's operation. The potential for fishing boats to trawl off the Mayo coast were hampered by a lack of adequate charts. In 1848, the Society of Friends hired a boat, and William Todhunter charted the coast of Galway, running northward to chart the waters of Clare Island, Achill Bay, Achill Island, and Black, shown how inadequate the charts of the day were, and the information gathered was passed on, and the Royal Navy was persuaded to rechart the coasts in aid of fishing. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a map of the coast of Mayo that William Todhunter had surveyed, an area that he went, and those arrows just show him going off into Mayo and back down again. But you know from the piers right up to Blacksod Bay, it was the west coast of Mayo that he covered in that survey. So agricultural projects was going to be another obvious approach. And early in 1848, Henry Brett, the county surveyor for Mayo, proposed that the Central Relief Committee should become involved in helping destitute farmers of Erris to cultivate their lands. A landowner in the Ballina area, Colonel Vaughan Jackson, came forward with an offer on behalf of himself and other landowners on the Mayo-Sligo border to give the use of land free of rent and poor rates for the growing of one crop under the superintendence of the committee. In all, some 900 acres were offered, and the committee decided to become involved. Now, I might say here, because I did mention this went into Sligo, but this is not cheating, because at that time the Mayo-Sligo border ran down the river Ballina, and its subsequent Sligo is now in Mayo, so that justifies me mentioning it. So a landowner, this experience had the objectives to give employment to destitute farmers and labourers, to teach those working on to reclaim land and make it better able to grow crops in subsequent seasons, so as to keep the farming methods which would be available to the workers in later years. It was decided to use spade cultivation for all crops rather than more capital-intensive things like ploughing. The project initially employed 120 men, rising to more than 1,000 for a time. They were divided into gangs and were taught by a practical instructor from the Royal Agricultural Society. This project was not without its problems. The labourers were generally in very poor condition after the starvation which they had suffered, and as they were to be paid by task work on the scheme, the rate of pay was higher than normal to allow for their lower productivity. In July 1848, 2 members of the Central Relief Committee visited the project and agreed that the exercise to the area. An auctioneer was engaged to look after this, but found that there were no takers for the green crops and recommended that they be used locally. Had he found buyers, the proceeders would have been ploughed back into the relief work, but instead the project was deemed to be a financial loss. In all, some £7,500 had been spent, and the return from sales came to only £1,750. Bearing in mind the 3 main objects of this scheme, to provide employment, teach growing of crops, and the reclamation of land, the Ballina spade cultivation project counts. It was an added bonus that it ended up providing a cheap source of food in the locality. In the following season, the beneficial effects of the project continued. A local newspaper in Ballina reported on the 16th of May 1849 that it is gratifying to find that every man having the smallest holding and removed all possible care. This is a most important feature in our Irish agricultural pursuits, and one which is mainly attributable to the exertions of the Society of Friends here last year. The Central Relief Committee did not repeat its own efforts in Mayo in 1849. However, loans were extended to landowners who wished to try something similar on their own initiative. In March 1849, Colonel Knox Gore of Balik Manor Ballina was lent £800 to allow him to cultivate 100 acres of his land. Was lent £800 to allow him to cultivate 100 acres of his land by spade labour, in addition to 200 acres which he was cultivating at his own expense. It was unfortunate that the price of turnips and cattle feed fell in that year, so that Colonel Knox Gore did not make the returns he expected, but the improvements to the land helped to ensure that his return was good in the following year, and the exercise was a financial success eventually. It was also a success in providing employment, and he took on almost every person who asked for work. Also gave out a sizable number of grants for the relief of small farmers in 1849. This was a scheme whereby they gave financial support to help farmers to re-establish themselves, and this was done by paying the farmers to carry out improvements on their own lands. These grants were paid out in a similar way to the food grants of 2 years before and R. St George of Crossmolina. The relief workers of the Society of Friends believed that if the country was to be returned to economic prosperity, it would need to diversify its employment, and local industry was seen as a possibility in many areas. Industrial employment did not become a major relief work, but there were some notable projects. The Vicar of Burrashul, George R. Gildee, set out to establish linen manufacture in Newport and was assisted with finance from the Central Relief Committee. Ultimately, this was not successful, but the committee thought that despite its failure, it was a praiseworthy enterprise and provided a considerable amount of relief while it lasted. One industrial project was a direct result of the Ballina spade cultivation project of 1848, and once again it featured Colonel Knox Gore of Bleak Manor. About 75 acres of flax was grown during the project in order to encourage the establishment of flax growing as a local enterprise, and the crop was purchased by the firm of Bennett of Newport. The company also approached the Central Relief Committee with a project to establish a factory for steeping and preparing flax in Ballina. A loan of £500 was advanced, and the factory was built in nearby Ardnaree, which was then in County Sligo. Bernard and Koch also ran a flax operation at Newport with, quote, the comfortable appearance of their workpeople. Colonel Knox Gore put forward a proposal to build a flax scutching mill to complement the rettery at Ballina, and the committee lent him £400 for this purpose, though he only used 200 of this, putting up £800 of his own capital. When it was found that the flax grown during spade cultivation project was not particularly good. In the 1849 season, however, some 260 acres of flax were sown locally with much more success, and this increased to 400 acres in 1850, yielding an estimated profit of £5 to £6 10 shillings per acre. This provided much needed employment on the land and also gave work to 100 people in the factory. So the projects which were backed by the Society of Friends in Mayo during the famine were not always successful in terms of their financial return, as can be seen in the ultimate results of the fisheries at Balmullet or the spade cultivation at Ballina. This cannot be used as a means for assessing success, however, as the main object of the exercise was to provide food, income, training and longer-term prospects. In these terms, the projects were extremely successful, though it will never be possible to establish the number of lives that may have been saved or how many people did not have to emigrate during the famine as a result. In purely statistical terms, the Quaker Relief Committee provided almost 700 tonnes of food in County Mayo, along with 29 soup boilers, 61 batches of clothing, £2,300 in cash, and £54,000 of seeds. Nationwide, worth of relief. However, these figures mean little, as they do not quantify the saving of life and they also ignore the contribution made through loans which were repaid and therefore do not appear as expenditure in the accounts. There are some ways in which the idea of the benefits is suggested, such as when the Central Poor Law Union in September 1849 to get it out of a crisis, noting that this sum was to be repaid if practicable. Of far greater benefit to the Union was the Committee's expenditure on agriculture projects, and Colonel Knox-Gore estimated that by 1850 the Ballina Union was saving some £25,000 a year through the number of people who were no longer in need of assistance due to finding employment on these schemes. The effect was noticed in other areas where the poor rate was seen to be reduced as a result of employment offered through the loans from the Quaker committees for agricultural projects. At the end of the famine, the Central Relief Committee published a comprehensive report of its work, and this expressed the belief that the work had been a failure. In the circumstances when such a vast number of people had died and an even greater number had been forced to emigrate, no relief organisation could possibly claim that it had been a success. However, the amount which had been achieved by such a small band of dedicated workers was out of all proportion to their numbers or their distribution around the country to the people of Mayo during that most awful catastrophe. And when I say at the end of the thing, these were businessmen, they were merchants, and they looked on anyone who donated money to the system as being like their shareholders. And so at the end of the famine, instead of just they set about writing a report aimed at people who had donated money to show them how the money had been spent. And it's just a small little report, published in 1852. And it's about 800 pages long, and it's an incredible source of information for what Thank you very much.